Good afternoon to everyone. I am William Farfan-Rios, one of the Living Earth Collaborative postdocs. And thank you for joining our last seminar of the spring semester from the Living Earth Collaborative and Washington University's Evolution, Ecology, and Population Biology group. I have the great pleasure to introduce Dr. Sebastián Tello as today's speaker. He is an outstanding scientist, but also an extraordinary mentor and a good friend. Dr. Tello is an associate scientist with the Center for Conservation and Sustainable Development at the Missouri Botanical Garden. He is a scientific director of the Madidi Project, and he is an adjunct professor in the biology department at Washington University in St. Louis and University of Missouri. Dr. Tello earned his PhD degree from Louisiana State University, and then he completed his postdoc at the Missouri Botanical Garden. Dr. Tello's research interests aim at studying how species respond to environmental change, what mechanisms shape those responses, and how these processes give rise to biodiversity patterns. His work is focused mainly on the Neotropics, particularly in the Andes, which is one of the hottest hotspots of biodiversity on Earth. Throughout his career, Dr. Tello is building an impressive profile of publications in prestigious journals, including Neophytologist, Natural Communications, and Science, among others. Alongside his impressive scientific career, Dr. Tello is dedicated to mentoring and teaching. He has provided mentorship for 8 grad students, 2 postdocs, which is I am one of them, and multiple undergrad students. He also has a strong commitment to teaching art programming through workshops in the United States and different Latin American countries. Before I hand it over to Dr. Tello, I want to remind all the audience to leave questions and comments in the YouTube chat section, and we will read them at the end of the seminar. Without further delay, let me introduce you to Dr. Tello and his presentation entitled The Ecological and Evolutionary Ensemble of Regional Biotas in Tropical Mountains. Take that away, Dr. Tello.
Thank you so much, William. And thanks everyone for being here, and to the LEC for allowing me this time to share sort of my research with you. So hopefully by the end of my talk today, you will learn a little bit more about the type of research that I'm doing, and a little bit more about how evolutionary and ecological processes come together to assemble communities in tropical mountains. But before I go too much further, I wanted to first thank all the collaborators that have contributed in one way or another to this project and to the ideas that I'm going to be sharing with you today. There's lots of people that have helped me in this sense, and this is just a group of them, and you probably recognize many of them as most of them have been or are here in St. Louis. So first of all, thank you all very much. And in particular, I want to thank our team of researchers also in Bolivia, who have for 20 years worked to collect some of the data that we are using today to answer some of these questions. Okay, so often in my presentations, I like to start with a map like this. Not only because I think it's a really cool looking map, but because from graduate school up to today, when I see a figure like this, I get excited. I think it's super interesting how biodiversity is so heterogeneously distributed across the space and across time. And some places of the planet harbor a huge, a disproportionate fraction of diversity, which has challenges or poses challenges for both basic research in ecology and evolution, but also for the conservation of biodiversity and the management of ecosystems. When we try to understand these gradients of biodiversity, we often make reference to environmental gradients of multiple types. This example here, this map here, shows a large-scale gradient in soil temperatures. And environmental conditions are thought to influence biodiversity in multiple different ways. And they are behind a lot of our many of our theories and hypotheses for how biodiversity is distributed. However, in ecology, we often assume that these biodiversity gradients, these environmental gradients are permanent or are fixed, are unchanging. But this is clearly not true. Both gradients at very large geographic scales like this, or gradients at small scales like this, which is a map of nutrient distributions within a forest plot here near us at Tyson Research Center. Both of these gradients must have had an origin. Environmental gradients in general change through the history of places, but also during the history of the diversification of clades. And that change, sort of how environmental gradients emerge and disappear, can have very significant consequences for biodiversity. And so I'm particularly interested in understanding how communities assemble after novel environmental gradients appear in a region. One of the main ways in which we get large-scale environmental gradients in the planet is by mountain uplift. And this is the system that we are using to study this question. In the Americas, particularly in the Neotropics, the uplift of the Andes has had enormous consequences for the distribution of climates and other environmental conditions, but also for the distribution of biodiversity. This map here shows the distribution in species richness for most of South America and parts of Central America. And what you can see from this map is that high diversity often occurs in regions of high topographic heterogeneity. It occurs in mountains. The high diversity of these mountainous regions is related to how species change across environments. So here in this figure, I show the traditional species richness gradients across elevation, in which as you move from lowlands to highlands, you also move from communities of high diversity to communities of lower diversity. However, this change in the communities, in the diversity of communities, is not purely a change in numbers of species. There is actually a replacement of species, so that the communities that are species poor are not simply a subset of the species-rich communities. There's actually quite a significant replacement of the species you find in the lowlands with respect to the species that you find in the highlands. This gives rise to a relationship between species turnover and difference or distance in elevation, or really in any other environmental condition that you can think of. And it's this replacement of species from one community to another across the gradient that is an important explanation for why mountainous regions are often so diverse. So in the projects that we are developing in my research group, the main question is, how does the emergence of novel environmental gradients, in our case specifically created by the uplift of the Andes, has led to the assembly of communities across elevations that contribute to this enormous turnover and that also contribute to the diversity of large-scale regions. And there's two hypotheses that we're working with. On the one hand, the uplift of the Andes created new environmental conditions, and these environmental conditions might have created opportunities for the immigration of pre-adapted lineages. So what you would have is, so in this figure, the dashed line represents the moment the new environmental gradient appears. In this case, the uplift of the Andes happens. And what we expect to see is that different clades will occupy different elevations. And that is because as the mountains arise and new environments appear, those environments are colonized by species that were pre-adapted to those novel environmental conditions. So critical here is that each one of these clades diverge from the other clades before the emergence of the gradient, before the uplift of the Andes, and that each one of these clades also has a relatively narrow elevational distribution because the species in that clade are adapted to a specific subset of the environments across elevations. There are examples in the literature of clades that might have done something like this. The Andean lupinus might be one of the best studied clades of Andean plants. And what this figure shows is how the Andean lupinus, here in yellow, are nested within a larger clade that includes these red species from temperate North America. And what seems to have happened is that these species from temperate North America colonized the Andes. They diversified enormously into lots of different life forms. But in terms of their environmental associations, most of the species remain tightly linked to temperate conditions at higher elevations. And so these would suggest that potentially the lupinus represent an example of one of these lineages that was pre-adapted to the conditions created by the uplift of the mountains. An alternative way to think of the assembly of communities after the uplift is to think of the role of adaptive radiation. So again, the mountains create novel environmental conditions. And now in this case, the new conditions can provide potentially conditions for the evolution of new adaptations and new traits that allow a species to colonize different environments. So for example, in this cartoon, the green clade could have been in the region before the uplift or could have arrived after the uplift. But the new conditions created by the uplift provided opportunities for species to find novel adaptations and colonize novel environments. And as a consequence, this clade is distributed across much of the elevational gradient. And obviously this could have happened across multiple different clades, showing a pattern of diversification of adaptive radiation. So the focus of this work is to try to not really prove one hypothesis or the other, because these processes are really not mutually exclusive. What we're trying to find out is whether one of these processes has a bigger effect or has contributed more to the assembly of communities than the other. And so I'm gonna elaborate a little bit on a prediction made by the first hypothesis, the integration of pre-adapted lineages hypothesis. For the sake of time, I'm not gonna talk much about the predictions made by the second hypothesis. But the hypothesis is about species turnover, or the change in species composition from one community to another. And so for our analysis, we're gonna be comparing communities that are, for example, at the same elevation, when we make this comparison between these two communities, but also making comparisons of species, or sorry, of communities that are increasingly at different elevations and consequently in different environmental conditions. The key of this prediction is that the species turnover, or the change in species from one community to another, can be decomposed into a within clade component and an among clade component. And this might require a little bit of explanation, but I think it's worth it to be able to understand the rest of the analysis. So here again is a cartoon example. We have two sites and we have several species. And turnover between these communities is created when a species is present in one site, but not in the other. Presences are indicated by ones, absences by zero. And so as you can see, there are multiple species that are one side, but not in the other. And so that creates a turnover of a species or change in the species composition. The important thing here is to note that these species also belong to clades. And specifically in terms of this hypothesis, to clades that diversified before the uplift of the Andes, before the emergence of the environmental conditions. And so once we know that, we can see that some of this turnover of a species from one side to the other also correspond to turnover of clades. In this example, the gray clade here is present in site 2, but all of the species from this same clade are absent from site 1. And correspondingly, all the species from the yellow clade are present in site 1, but they are all absent in site 2. So this is a turnover in a species that corresponds also to a turnover in clades. And so this is the fraction of turnover that corresponds to the among clades turnover. A turnover in a species that also implies turnover in clades. And also there is a turnover within clades. So for example, in the green clade, we have species of the clade in both sites. In site 1 has a species 7, site 2 has a species 6 and a species 8. There is huge amount of turnover in the clade, but the clade itself is present in both sites. So in this case, this portion of turnover corresponds to turnover within clades. That means turnover of a species within a specific clade. These two pieces of turnover can be combined in an additive way to get the total amount of turnover that you have from site 1 to site 2. Okay. So here goes the predictions. So if this idea of the immigration of pre-adapted lineages is true, we expect a distribution of the clades similar to this in the cartoon. When we compare two communities at the same elevation, for example, this one here and this one over here, these correspond to two communities with 0 difference in elevation, which in this figure corresponds to this point right here. When we are comparing communities in the same environment, we expect that those environments will be dominated, in this case, for example, by the green clade. So the turnover among clades for these communities will be very low. And that is depicted here in the figure as a low value for this orange line here. But increasingly, as you compare communities at different elevations, you will start moving into comparisons where one community is in one environment dominated by one clade, and the other is in a different environment dominated by a different clade. And so as you increase that difference in elevation, there is a difference in environmental conditions, the proportion of turnover corresponding to among clades will increase. And this is the key prediction made by this hypothesis. Correspondingly, there is a fraction of turnover within clades that simply should follow the opposite pattern. When communities are at the same elevation, there should be high turnover within clades, but as communities are farther and farther away along the elevational gradient, the turnover within clades should decrease. And at some point, the turnover among clades should be higher than the turnover within clades. And this is the key prediction that we are going to test. To test this prediction and this hypothesis, I'm going to present two different studies. One study is at a regional scale, looking at how local communities change across elevational gradients. So in this case, the focus is local communities, the small scale communities, and how communities at different elevations change in species composition, and how much of that is among clades versus within clades to gain insights about these processes. The second study, that is something that I'm just developing, has to do with turnover not among communities, but among biogeographic regions. Biogeographic regions that represent highlands, like the Central Andes, which will be the focus, and other biogeographic regions that represent the lowlands, like, for example, all of Amazonia. Okay, the first study, the regional study. So as I mentioned, we used two different elevational gradients for this study. One was developed by ABERG, which is a research group that William belongs to. This elevational gradient is in Peru, close to the Manu National Park. And the Madidi project, that is the project that I work on and that the Missouri Botanical Garden has been working on for about 20 years in Bolivia. This figure shows the size that we have surveyed for both projects. Up here in Peru, we have the forest plots associated with the ABREC project, and down here, the forest plots associated with the Madidi project. Each one of these plots corresponds to a forest plot that has been surveyed. It's typically 100 by 100 meters or 50 by 20 meters. But inside each one of these plots, we have collected, measured, and identified all the trees of a specific size. There are some large plots, there are some small plots. That doesn't really matter all that much. But the important thing is that each one of these plots represents a community, and these communities are distributed across a huge elevational gradient. In green here, you have the plots and sites in the Amazon forests at 250 meters of elevation approximately. And the network of forest sites climbs up the mountain all the way to the tree line at around almost 4,000 meters in elevation. In total, there's about 2,700 species of trees found in this data set. This is the species turnover that we see in that data set. As expected, sites that are close in elevation, at zero difference in elevation, typically have communities that are more similar in terms of species composition. And as you increase the difference in elevation, as you compare communities that are farther and farther away along this environmental gradient, you have fewer and fewer species in common. To the point that if you have two communities that are more than 2,000, 2,500 meters of elevation apart, then suddenly those communities never share any species at all. And that makes sense. Some of these communities are in very contrasting environments. In the lowlands, you have sites that are very, very hot, very warm, very humid, sometimes seasonally flooded. And in the highlands, you have places that are a lot cooler with a lot of topographic heterogeneity, and that sometimes are immersed in clouds for long periods of time. So to test these ideas, obviously the time of the uplift of the Andes is super important, because we need to know what diversification happened before the uplift and what diversification happened after the uplift. So we can create these clades that represent lineages that colonized the region and that diverged from other clades before the emergence of the gradient. Fortunately for us, the Central Andes is relatively well known in terms of the uplift history. These three figures here show a recent compilation of this type of data that shows essentially a reconstruction of the paleo-elevation in different parts of the Central Andes. We have the Altiplano, the Eastern Cordillera, and the Western Cordillera. Our sites or elevational gradients are in the Eastern Cordillera, but as you can see, there's some heterogeneity here too. The Western Cordillera seems to be potentially significantly older than the Eastern Cordillera or the Altiplano. And so to take in account this heterogeneity, we've used two different time points as potential moments when the uplift of the Central Andes started. We used 30 million years, that is a good date for the Altiplano and the Eastern Cordillera. And we also used 60 million years, which is a good time for the Western Cordillera of the Central Andes. At the end of the day, these two times produce very similar results. So I'm gonna be focused only on the results produced using the 30 million year cut to define the origin of the elevational gradient. So we took all of the species in our data, and we were able to map those species into the Smith and Brown megaphylogeny. So we produced a phylogeny that has nearly 3,000 tips connecting all the species in our forest plots. And then we use the 30 million years and the 60 million years time frame to cut this phylogenetic tree into individual clades that represent the clades that diverged before the uplift of the Andes, before the emergence of the gradient, and that are a key part of the analysis. Okay. So in doing that, we have the species composition turnover across the elevations, and now we have the clades that each species belongs to. So now we can finally partition the turnover into among clade turnover and within clade turnover. And that's what I'm going to show you here. This is the empirical pattern we found. We found that with increasing differences in elevation, the among clade turnover increases rapidly, and the within clade turnover decreases correspondingly rapidly too. In fact, when we have communities at the same elevation, at zero difference in elevation, in the same environments, both the within and among clade turnover contribute similarly, proportionally, in proportion to the turnover. But quickly, the among clade turnover becomes the most important component of turnover across communities. We wanted to compare this to a pattern that erases all phylogenetic history in the distributions of the species. And so we produced a null model that accounted for other things, like, for example, the richness gradient or the variation in number of individuals across plots, but essentially erased all of the history in the elevational distributions of the species. And this figure to the right shows the pattern produced by that simple null model. As you can see, even the null model creates a little bit of structure, but nowhere near the structure that we see in the empirical data. In fact, when we compare the empirical pattern to the random pattern, there's still a very strong effect, a very strong signal in those deviations of the empirical data from the null distributions. So what this tells us, or the way we are interpreting these data and these results, is that even though these two processes are important, to us, it seems that the immigration of pre-adapted lineages seems to have a very strong effect on how communities assemble across different elevations. When you move from one environment to the other, the turnover of clades is very high and it happens very quickly. So that takes us to the second study. Now this is about the assembly, not of local communities across elevations, but of regional biotas across the whole continent. The focus of the analysis, again, is going to be the Central Andes. So the key question here is, how did the uplift of the Central Andes lead to the assembly of the flora of that region? And to do that, again, I'm going to compare the composition of the biota of the Central Andes to the biota, to the composition of the floras and biotas of the other regions in the continent. I divided the continent in these biogeographic regions. There's multiple ways in which we can do this, but I'm sure that sort of differences in how to do this would really produce very little differences. The critical thing here in this division, and what I try to capture, is that some biogeographic regions have climates that are similar to the Central Andes, and some have climates and environmental conditions that are very different from those of the Central Andes. So for example, this is a map of mean annual temperature, and you can see the Central Andes, since it's dominated by mountains, it's on average a very cool biogeographic region. And that is similar to the Northern Andes, which is also dominated by mountains, forming essentially a corridor of temperate conditions that go all the way from the temperate parts of South America to the southernmost part of the continent. And then again, there's mountains in Central America that connect these temperate conditions also with the temperate regions of North America. On the other hand, we have biogeographic regions like Amazonia, which is much lower in elevation, and it's also obviously a lot warmer. So a very contrasting environmental condition, even though the Central Andes and Amazonia are actually quite close to each other. And so, as I said, we're going to look at the turnover of a species from one biogeographic region to the other to get clues about the processes that have led to the assembly of the biota of the Central Andes. And just like we did for the communities at different elevations, we can think of this as the assembly of biogeographic regions of different environmental conditions. So, for example, the uplift of the Central Andes and the origin of the Central Andes could have created opportunities for immigration of clades that were already adapted to the temperate conditions created by the mountains. If that is true, we would see mainly a relationship, or we would see the similar thing to what we see across elevations, that regions of similar environmental conditions will share species within clades. Like here, for example, the Central Andes and the Northern Andes, both maybe share no species whatsoever, but the species they have, they both belong to this black clade. And the species found in the mountain regions are very different from the species in the lowlands because they belong to different clades of pre-Andean origin. And again, we can use these to make predictions about the turnover, the fractions of turnover, and how these fractions of turnover between biogeographic regions will change with environmental dissimilarity. So this in the x-axis here is regions with increasingly different environmental conditions from the Central Andes, which is the focus of the analysis. And in the y-axis, we have the turnover in species composition. So what we expect to see from this hypothesis is that when we are comparing the Central Andes to regions with very different environmental conditions, like the Amazon, most of the turnover of species will be a turnover that also involves the turnover of clades. So in this cartoon, going from species of the black clade to species of the green clade. And this should be true for all regions that have very different environmental conditions. In contrast, the turnover from the Central Andes to other temperate regions, like the Northern Andes or the temperate part of South America, the southern part of South America, should have the opposite pattern. Most of the turnover here should be among species, but within clades. So again, in the cartoon, if you go from Central Andes to Northern Andes, you might share no species, but the species belong to the same clade. And the other hypothesis is the adaptive diversification that essentially shows the opposite, right? The uplift of the Central Andes created opportunities for adaptive diversification, for the movement of species from lowlands to highlands and from highlands to lowlands. As the species evolve new adaptations that allow them to colonize these regions of different environmental conditions. And this could have happened multiple times in multiple different clades, leading to a very different structure in the distribution of clades across regions. This can also be made into a prediction about turnover. And essentially what this says is that regardless of the environmental dissimilarity, the turnover within clades is going to be quite high. And that is going to be true whether we're comparing the Central Andes to similar regions like the Northern Andes, or the Central Andes to very dissimilar regions like Amazonia. And so again, we're trying to distinguish these two hypotheses, or at least trying to tell whether one hypothesis has an effect that is greater than the other one. Some previous work has already suggested some potential answers. This is a paper studied by Segovia et al. From 2020, in which they used communities of trees. Each one of those is a tree community, and the phylogenetic relationships among the species to create, and what they found is that essentially there are two clusters of communities based on the phylogenetic similarities of these communities. One group of communities include, in blue here, include all the temperate North American communities, but also all of the mountains, both in Central America and in South America. And this result is quite striking. And the other clade essentially is everything else, or the other group is essentially everything else, mostly species communities present in the lowlands. The problem with this study, not the problem, but maybe a limitation, is that these studies focus only on trees, but also that they talk about, they use phylogenetic distances without any consideration of the specific timing of the uplift of the Andes. And so to address these issues, where you're using data from BIEN, which is the Botanical Information and Ecology Network, and we extracted the data from BIEN of the occurrences of every species of vascular plants across the entire continent. And so now, as you can see, instead of having solid colors, we have little dots in each one of the regions, and each one of those dots represents a specific occurrence in the data set. We did the best we could to clean up the data, eliminate issues, and the result was about 1 million occurrences across the entire continent. The figure here on the left shows the number of species that we found in each region. Unsurprisingly, the Amazon has about 13,000 species recorded, and that's mainly a result of the large area of the region. The Northern Andes, on the other hand, despite having a very small area, it has a large number of species, about 8,000 species. And the Central Andes is the fourth species with the highest diversity, with about 4,000 species. We again took the list of all the species in the data set, that in this case was around 32,000, and mapped them into the Smith and Brown mega phylogeny. So we have a phylogenetic tree that has 32,000 tips. And just like as before, before that, I did first an ordination that simply shows the relative position of different regions in terms of how similar or different they are in species composition. So what that simple analysis told me is that the Central Andes and the Southern Andes share the most species. And then from that group, the next closest is the Northern Andes. So that makes sense. Sort of the regions with similar climates have similar species composition, but also the composition is quite different from the species like in Amazonia. I did the same thing, but instead of using simply species occurrences, presence absence in each region, I used also the phylogenetic distance between regions, similar to that studied by Segovia. And when I do the ordination using the phylogenetic information, I find that the Central Andes is again very tightly associated with the southern tip of South America, but now the Northern Andes also seems a lot closer, suggesting that even though there is a decent amount of turnover to the Northern Andes, those species are closely related to the species in the Central Andes. However, as I said, sort of these analyses don't account for the specific timing of the uplift. And these phylogenetic similarities could be based on really deep phylogenetic relationships, or they could be based on very recent phylogenetic relationships. So there's not a sense of when these relationships appeared and how it relates to the uplift of the Andes. So again, what I did is I took the phylogeny with 32,000 tips, and using a specific time, in this case 32 million years, I cut the phylogeny into individual clades that are the clades that I define as the clades that originated before the uplift of the Central Andes. Here, the colored clades are simply some of the most species-rich clade when I cut the phylogeny at 32 million years. On average, clades had about 10 species per clade. So again, this is the turnover from the Central Andes to each one of the regions. The red are the regions that are similar in climate. The gray are the ones that are different in climate. But really what I want to know is this turnover that we see from the Central Andes to other regions, how does it correspond to turnover within clades and turnover among clades? And so when I do the decomposition, these are the results, which are actually, to me, quite surprising. Because now what it says is that regardless of the region you're comparing the Central Andes to, the among clade component is actually small. And the overriding effect is that of the within clade component, suggesting that the same clades are present in multiple regions, certainly in the Central Andes and these other regions, and the turnover of species within those clades is what's driving the changes in composition from the Central Andes, both to other temperate regions, but also from the Central Andes to other regions like Amazonia, with very contrasting environmental conditions. I wanted, so that's in terms of the total proportion of turnover associated to these two components. However, I did compare these proportions to proportions expected by a random, simple null model, again, where any phylogenetic effect on the distribution of species is erased. And then here on the right, I show the deviations of each one of these fractions with respect to those null expectations. And what we can see is that even though the among clades components are a small proportion of the total turnover, they are still greater than you would expect given the simple null model. And that is that corresponds to these positive deviations, meaning that these fractions of variation are, or fractions of turnover, are higher than expected by the null model. On the other hand, the within clade component, even though it's the largest part of the turnover, they are typically negative, suggesting the opposite pattern, suggesting they are typically larger than what would be expected given the null model. So from these results, the conclusion seems to be that the adaptive diversification hypothesis, this idea that clades of a species move readily from lowlands to highlands, from highlands to lowlands, is potentially the better explanation for how the biota, the flora of the Central Andes came together. So when we compare, so this is the turnover that we found among local communities across elevational gradients in the left and across biogeographic regions on the right. And broadly, this is what we would expect. Communities or regions that have similar environments are more similar in species composition than communities or regions that are more different in environmental conditions. However, when we do this partitioning of the turnover into among and within clade turnover, the results from these two studies, or the analysis of these two scales, actually seem contradictory. For local communities along the elevational gradient, the among clades turnover seems to be the most important, but for the turnover across biogeographic regions, it seems that the within clade turnover is the most important one. I'm still trying to figure out what is the explanation for this apparent contradiction. But one of the possibilities is that the elevational study was focused on trees and on tree communities, while the biogeographic analysis included not only woody plants, but all vascular plants with many other life forms. So maybe some other life forms aside from trees are actually behaving differently. And so our next step here is to make that analysis of the biogeographic regions, separating the woody from the not woody species. And maybe that will help account for this apparent difference between these two scales. And also something else I would like to do in the near future is study more broadly this process. So this map shows all the mountain ranges of the world, and a fraction of these mountains occur in the tropics. And oftentimes when people think of the tropics, and even in scientific publications, when people talk about the tropics, they often imagine and talk about the lowlands. But tropical highlands are extremely important. They are potentially more diverse than any lowland region. And trying to understand what are the biogeographic origins of the flora and the fauna that lives in these tropical mountains seems like a very appealing project. So something I would like to do is refine the analysis we've been doing in South America and potentially expand it to try to understand the origins of the biotas of all these tropical mountains across the planet. With that, I hope that was okay. And if there's any questions, I will be very happy to answer them.
Thank you, Sebastian. Really, really fascinating seminar. It's incredible how this uplifted the Andes. I mean, it's still outstanding questions, how that influenced the diversity in these Neotropics. We have some questions for the audience coming in. So we have this question from Pile Jorhold. Sorry if I mispronounce your name. Hi, she says, I think the pre-adapted lineages can be also generalist across elevations. That is, they can immigrate more elevation belts at the time of immigration than just one belt as in the hypothesis. And also she has another question. She also said, what do you think, why is Eastern, I think South Amazonian, phylogenetically more similar to the Andes, geographically more distant than Amazon, geographically closer in the ordination plot?
So yeah, I think hopefully I understood the questions correctly, but yeah, the first question is about whether these clays that are at different elevations represent more generalist species, and that's certainly a possibility. There might be obviously, again, as I said, so these two hypotheses are not mutually exclusive. There are clades that will be doing one thing and clades that will be doing the other. And the objective of the project is to, given all those histories combined, what is the effect that has on community assembly? But sort of studying these processes also in individual clades is a very complementary way to do this. And it would be super interesting to know what makes some clades diversify rapidly across elevations, and maybe other clades have much more conserved niches. And potentially this idea of, generalists being more common in clades that diversify rapidly is certainly a possibility. It would be super interesting to answer that question. I don't remember the second question, William. Can you
yes.
Do it again?
Yes, the second was, what do you think, why is Eastern South America phylogenetically more similar to the Andes, geographically more distant than Amazon, geographically closer in the ordination plot? So you show that ordination plot.
It's difficult to know for sure, but sort of the way I define the Eastern South America, it's actually also very close to the Central Andes. It shares a border with the Central Andes, just like Amazonia. But also sort of the environmental conditions of that part of the continent might be a little bit more similar to the Central Andes than Amazonia. There's some topography in that region, and some of the climate, especially temperature, might be a little bit more similar to what we have in the Central Andes. The Andes also has some pockets of very dry vegetation, and some of those regions in Eastern South America also represent quite significantly dry habitats. We can also potentially explain some of that similarity. But there's a lot there to try to explain sort of those similarities or differences.
Excellent. Thanks again for a wonderful talk. As I've been watching your seminar, I'm wondering how this would compare across other mountain ranges that are younger or older than the Andes. And I know, you talked about this at the end, that you want to look at different mountain ranges, especially in the tropics. Do you have any basic hypotheses about whether your hypotheses are, maybe one hypothesis more supported by another, or by an older mountain range or a younger mountain range? Yeah, how do you think age of the mountain range would play into this?
Yeah, that's a really good question too. one could think that maybe there is an effect. Typically, you could think that younger mountain ranges probably haven't provided as much time for the evolution of new adaptations to happen, and so maybe those type of mountains will be more likely to fall into the category of communities assembled mainly by immigration of pre-adapted lineages, and maybe really old mountains have had more time for history and evolution to take place and adaptations to evolve, and so there will be a bit more of the adaptive diversification happening. But to be honest, that's we can make those predictions, but I don't really have no good idea whether that's true or not. It would be something another interesting thing to research too.
Thank you, Sebas. There is like a great comments in the chat about the great talk that you gave. I have kind of like a basic question. So it was suggested that it was like a rapid uplift of the Andes, like 10 million years ago or so.
Yeah.
Do you think that event like promote the your first hypothesis about the pre-adapted species looking just for trees? Because if we think it's a rapid event that will kill the not adapted and promote the persistence of adapted species, do you think that could be the case?
Yeah, I don't know. I think the history of the uplift of the Andes is a lot more complicated than we typically assume. And yeah, parts of the Andes seem to be quite young. 10 million years, 8 million years old. Some are quite old, and but it's difficult to say that one specific region was that young. It's possible that there were mountains much older than that, almost in any part of the Andes. Certainly as old as 30 or 60 million years old. So I guess that goes back to the previous question too. Sometimes just to know the age of mountains can be quite challenging to test these hypotheses. And importantly also, I mean, and that's a limitation of the work that I presented, is that it's taking the uplift as a single event. We are trying to capture the beginning of the uplift, but again, the uplift was complex, was heterogeneous in time. Sometimes it was quick, sometimes it was slow. So certainly a way to include the uplift of the Andes in more complicated ways and account for that heterogeneity would be really interesting way to move the field forward, because the environments at 2,000 meters in elevation are probably a lot older than the environments at 4,000 or 5,000 meters in elevation, and those type of differences are not captured in these analyses. I don't know if I answered your question, William.
I think you answered the question.
Okay.
We'll let William follow up after my question, which is actually a question coming from Jonathan Losses. So, and I agree, I was thinking about this as well. And so Jonathan's asking, would your approach work equally well for animals? And if I can, I'll also add on to that, like, or fungi or some other organisms as well.
Yeah, I don't see why not. I think so. Generally, the approach would work well for any organism. All you need is sort of the distribution of species and the in a phylogeny that links those species, and obviously the age, approximately the age of the mountains you're trying to study. But I don't see why it couldn't be applied to other organisms, and actually that's something we would like to do sometime soon, at least for this part of the continent, for the Central Andes.
Yeah, I wonder, with animals, especially more mobile species, if it would just be like faster that they would occupy a place. But at the same time, it's not like these mountains are just coming super fast, right? I mean, these mountains are taking hundreds of thousands of years to really become mountains. So maybe it doesn't really matter actually if you can move quickly, because trees can move quickly too, right? Over a span of 10,000 years, they can move really fast.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you, Sebas. Great. So another question is, so we know that dispersion, it's a important driver for community ensemble. So do you think you can like incorporate this dispersion phenomenon into your research? Are you planning to do that?
You mean like dispersal, like?
Yeah, like the dispersion syndrome, for example, for species, for plant species in general, for the trees, if that can support this pre-adaptive hypothesis.
Yeah, it's a good question. As I said, sort of understanding why some clays do one thing and why others do a different thing would be a really cool avenue for research that try to, associate specific traits to the specific types of evolution in response to the uplift. I haven't thought about the specific effect of dispersal and what it would have. But for example, sort of this assumption that sort of these continental level analyses might be different from the elevational gradient ones, because the continental ones includes lots of herbs. It might be that sort of many of these species have much faster generation times, which potentially kind of help them evolve more quickly. And so for those species, there has been enough time to colonize regions of different environmental conditions, but maybe for trees, there hasn't been enough time to do that. There can be other things aside from generation time that could explain those differences, but I still don't know if there's difference exists at all. But it's a hypothesis that I would like to test sometime soon.
Another question just popped in, I think following up from Jonathan, my question by Gerardo Camilo. And he says, but the interactions that are more co-evolved, like herbivory, may follow a similar pattern? Question mark.
So can you repeat it? Sorry.
Yeah, so he says, but the interactions that are more co-evolved, like herbivory, may follow a similar pattern? Question mark. So I think what he's asking is perhaps, as these plants are moving out, and you have the herbivores like insects and other organisms, though, are following like where these plants are going. And I guess he's just asking for like whether you think that is a suitable hypothesis, or does it not make sense?
Yeah, I guess it does. It's very interesting to think sort of the consequences that this can have for species interactions too. To be honest, I haven't thought about that all that much. But yeah, I guess when you have strong species interactions, the movement of one species might be helped or constrained by others, and depending on the nature of the interactions. And that could also help explain why some clades might diversify quickly across elevations, some don't. Yeah, I don't have a good answer for that, but certainly it's interesting.
Thank you, Sebas. We have the last question from Ethan Abercrombie. Do you think ecotones influence the relative importance of these two processes across elevation? Question mark.
That's a very good question too. The way I treated sort of the elevational gradient in that first analysis was everything, all elevations were equivalent to one another. But certainly people think that that's not true. There are certain points along the elevational gradient where environmental conditions change, particularly in the base clouds, so in the cloud base, where you start having the presence of clouds quite often in the forest, and that transition from being inside or outside the cloud base can provide significant and almost like a quick changing environmental conditions that creates a soft environmental limit to the distribution of many species. So maybe regions like that could be particularly important in the transition from regions dominated by some clays to regions dominated by other clays. At higher elevations, once you go from places that have freezing conditions to places that don't have freezing conditions, that could be another point along the elevational gradient where there can be a relatively quick changing environmental conditions that can also imply limits between the distributions of whole clades. I haven't done anything sort of trying to distinguish whether that is happening, but yet again, it's another super interesting thing to try to find out.
Thank you, Sebastian. Really interesting indeed. Unfortunately, it's time to go. Thank you again, Sebastian, for joining us and for sharing your fantastic work. Or maybe I should say double thanks for joining us today because you were not feeling well and you made it. And thanks to the audience for tuning in, and have a great summer.